This will be our main lecture on Cinderella and will actually be used as well for us to have a chance to discuss the authors, the authorship issue, and some of the nationalities involved. So let's get started with Cinderella. Now we begin with Giambattista Basile, who lived from around 1576 to 1632. He was in Italy. In fact, he died indirectly because of Mount Vesuvius of Pompeii fame. There was a flu epidemic that broke out in the aftermath of an explosion from Vesuvius, an eruption from Vesuvius. And he published The Tale of Tales, Il Conto dei Conti in Italian. It was published after his death in 1634. And then by the fourth edition, it was renamed Il Pentamerone, which is similar to the more famous Decameron, or Decamerone, from Boccaccio. And the two of them share a frame narrative concept, meaning that there's kind of a major story, a main story, and then a bunch of sub-stories slotted in around the issues in the main story. And Basile is typically thought of as a satirist. He is discussing the peasants in terms of the nobility and the nobility in terms of the peasants. He's really kind of comparing the two classes. Though there are, as you can see on the screen, some peasant messages of luck and self-reliance built into the messages that he has in his fairy tales, and we'll see some of those. Now, his stories are literate, meaning that they make the kind of allusions and metaphors and analogies that one would only expect to get if one understood the literature and was themselves someone who could read. So it's not a folk tale in that sense. It doesn't claim to be a folk tale. In fact, it claims to be a literary fairy tale, in the fairy tales that he tells. Meaning literary fairy tales are different from folk tales. Folk tales come from the common people. We don't know who the author is, oral transmission, that sort of thing. Literary fairy tales are ones, it's just a category we've created, where we know who the author is. So let's talk about Cat Cinderella, his version of the Cinderella story. And we're dealing here with a princess, so this is a girl who is already of the nobility, in fact, of the royalty, and she's got many of the things that are similar that we'll see in later versions of the story. So there's stepmother, in fact, there's two stepmothers, there's an ineffective father, and it's the girl who takes things into her own hands. And so that's what we're seeing here with the bullet point for murder. In fact, the girl has an original stepmother, and the girl murders this original stepmother in order to get ahead. In fact, it's an idea planted in her mind by someone who would become the second stepmother. And so this girl, her name is Zezolla, not Cinderella, actually. Zezolla gets kind of a bum deal out of this, and she has to trick her way to freedom and escape at one point. Which really is in keeping with the peasant messages we see in most fairy tales, which is be crafty, lie and steal and cheat, and even murder, as Zezolla does. Do what it takes to get ahead. Now, the slipper from the familiar story, right? She goes to a ball and is dressed up, and the slipper, in fact, is an accident when it falls. And this is the first time we have the story, and indeed it's an accident there, but it actually ends up being the only one in the printed versions of the stories which is where it remains to be an accident. As we'll see in the other versions, it's not an accident every time we see the Cinderella story. We're switching now to Charles Perrault, who was in France, and he lived from 1628 to 1703. He was a secretary to Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Controller General of Finances, basically the most powerful minister in the court of Louis XIV. So Perrault was deeply invested with the court of the Sun King, and his stories reflect that. So you'll see kind of mentions of courtly intrigue or implying that the plot should move along the lines of what one would expect from the French king, the court at the French king, and so forth. And so his authorial presence is always very strong when his versions of the stories. He was a poet. He was an author. He was a salon goer. So the French salons where art and especially literature is discussed by intelligentsia. That was Perrault's world, and that's possibly the intended audience of the work in front of us, not necessarily for children. Now, he published in 1697 Histoire ou conte du temps passé, in English, History of Past Times. I'm sorry, History or Stories of Past Times, and his son's name was listed as the author, possibly to avoid arguments about the one of the contemporary debates raging at the time, which was whether one ought to have art that was more in line with what the ancients did or do what the modern people are doing, the ancients versus the moderns. And so Perrault avoided all of that by just using his son's name when publishing the work. So his version of Cinderella, Cendrillon, also kind of means the same thing as Cinderella. It's girl with cinders, girl from ashes. And it's the story of a girl who is able to triumph by being good. She has bonne qualité. And she also has luck. And so being good, not usually a function of fairy tales, but it is the case in Cinderella, at least Perrault's Cinderella. Luck, however, is very commonly associated with what it takes to get ahead. So we could look at these fairy tales and always ask ourselves, how does the hero or heroine triumph? What is the answer for that? And that will tell us something about what the story is trying to say, whether the author intended that or not. Now, Perrault will almost intentionally remind us of his background in the French king's court by pointing out things like fashion, and he gets very specific about the point lace trim collars and patches that are worn on one's face as blemishes and so forth. And there are other stories in which he talks about food that is really not peasant food; it's high quality food. So that's Perrault. Being Perrault and aiming the story at his intended audience in the salons rather than for children. So the girl has small feet, and this is what the slipper is there to verify. Only a girl with appropriately small feet can fit into the slipper. And that really can be thought of as related to the historical lens of thinking about fairy tales. What does it mean when you have small feet? Well, it means that you don't stand and work all day. It means that you're nobility. Because if you are a part of the peasantry, if you're out there working in the fields, your feet spread and they get larger. So having small, dainty feet means that you don't have to stand, you don't have to work for a living. In fact, long traditions of royalty in Western Europe of being carried around so that they're not even touching the ground. Now, let's come to the slipper itself. Instead of falling by accident, and in the French, if you look at the original French, it's elle laissa tomber, right? She lets it fall. Which means that she has chosen to let the slipper fall, so presumably the prince would come searching for her and accept her on her own terms, her own merits, rather than it being a complete accident. And so there's a little bit of an element of the girl seizing control here, not what one usually associates with the term having a Cinderella complex. That sounds more passive, but this isn't necessarily very passive from the Perrault version of the girl. Her slippers are made of glass. Why glass? Well, because glass was very expensive in the almost 1700s. So the 1600s were at when Perrault writes this. It's not that common that that objects of art are made out of glass. It's still done by Venetians, and it's prized more than gold in some cases. In fact, it's prized as more expensive than gold in the Bible, among other places. You will hear people occasionally talk about the Perrault version of the story and the slippers specifically, asking if there's a mistranslation. So glass slippers, glass is verre, V-E-R-R-E, in the Perrault. And people wonder, well, maybe Perrault heard the story from someone and transcribed it, and it was supposed to say verre, which is V-A-I-R-E, spelled differently, pronounced almost the same, which means fur. So the idea could be, was this supposed to be fur slippers? But it seems a pretty ludicrous thing to try to claim because, this elegant gown coupled with fur slippers seems just a little bit too much to go along with. So let's introduce ourselves to the Grimms. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were academics. Jacob lived from 1785 to 1863. Wilhelm from 1786, he was younger, to 1859 and died first. Now, they were academics, they were linguists and Germanists, so they were more famous during their lifetime for the Grimm's Wörterbuch, the dictionary, sort of like the Oxford English Dictionary. It covers the history of the language and all the various definitions of what a word could mean and where it came from, its etymology and so forth. And so the Grimm's Dictionary is really how they made their mark. Now, a few other things about them that is significant. First, they are themselves religious. They're Protestant, and they allow that to creep into the nature of the stories that they're telling. As we'll see, there are multiple editions of the Grimm's works, and they keep changing the editions. And in the changes, we'll find things like more references to God and more punishment of the evil and more reward for the people who did not do anything morally corrupt. And the Grimms were also nationalistic, possibly a bullet point that didn't make it onto the screen here. They were living in a Germany that doesn't look like the Germany we think of today. It was a patchwork of several dozen kingdoms and dukedoms and fiefdoms and baronies and city-states. It really did not coalesce into a country, despite all speaking the same language, until many decades after the Grimms were gone. So the Grimms were nationalistic, trying to imagine a Germany that was united, and one of the ways they imagined that was through nostalgia. Okay, the period that we're talking about here, Enlightenment, Romanticism, is kind of the art and literature names for the time period the Grimms are writing in. Looked back often at the medieval period, when Germany, among other places, was ruled from the Holy Roman Empire. And so the Holy Roman Empire, the power of the church, to rule over a large part of Western Europe, at least gave them sort of one giant country. And so the Grimms were nostalgic for medieval times, nostalgic for the Holy Roman Empire, partly for political reasons, but also partly just because being nostalgic and looking backwards, looking at the origins of things, this was tied to the period, the movement called Romanticism in general. Not just about love, it's about looking at nature, it's about closeness with nature, going back to origins, and very much a religious thing as well. The origins meaning our original relationship with our Creator. So this nostalgia drives another author at the time, Clemens Brentano, to go out and collect folk songs, which he publishes under the title Des Knabens Wunderhorn, the boy's magic horn. And inspired by this, the Grimms go collect, instead of folk songs, they collect folk tales, trying to do something similar to what Brentano had done. And so in 1810, they send a manuscript of their collection over to Brentano. And they keep a copy for themselves that they later destroy. And then they don't publish a first edition until 1812. Well, it turns out they'll publish several editions, 7 of them in total. In 1819 comes the second edition, and that's where most of the major changes have been done by then. It's just tweaking after that. And the 7th edition isn't published until 1857. Now, all the translations you've ever seen in English of the Grimm's fairy tales are of this 7th edition. So we will take care to talk about what was in the first edition, the second edition, or the manuscript edition, if there is one for that particular story. Now, there isn't a manuscript version of Cinderella. And there's a little bit more to say about the manuscript itself. The Grimms sent it to Brentano, and then they destroyed their own. And for a long time, the world thought that the first edition in 1812 and 1814 was really all that the Grimms had. No one had access to the original material. But then the manuscript was discovered, the Brentano manuscript was discovered in a monastery in Alsace in 1910. So 100 years have gone by, and the manuscript is plucked out of these archives and been published in German since then, not in English. So what do the Grimms do? They change their stories over time. They make them more nationalistic. They certainly make them more Christian. Sometimes they punish the evil a little bit more. They take out the sexuality when it's there, and we'll point out how these things had done. had been happening and so forth. And all the while they're claiming that these are, collected versions of the stories. And even that is doubtful. There has been a number of published articles and books that point out that the Grimm's sources were in fact literate people that could have known Perrault, who came before them, rather than being illiterate and therefore telling an oral tradition type of story. So, and even the Grimms note that the version of Cinderella in question is one that seems to have come from Perrault in the first place. So let's turn our attention to Cinderella, Aschenputtel, as it's called here. No 1810 version in this one. 1812, the first edition, is all we have. And this is immediately similar to Perrault, just in terms of the plot and what happens and when it happens. And some of the main interests can be in looking at the differences between the 1812 first edition and if you just compare it straight to the 7th edition, 1857, you'll see some things have been changed. So one of them is who thinks that this is a foreign princess. So in the 1812 version, it's the prince who thinks she's a princess, and that later gets moved over to the sisters, the stepsisters, who thinks it's a princess. Why? What's going on? Well, if you think about the role of the slipper in the prince in the first place, it was really just to confirm that that the girl is of nobility or aristocracy in the first place. Why couldn't he marry someone who doesn't fit the slipper? Well, because that would not be someone of noble birth, and therefore big feet can't. That would be scandalous. So this also answers that question that perhaps you've asked yourself this over time. Why doesn't the prince just look her in the face and say, well, this is the right one? I mean, I've been dancing with her all night. Shouldn't he know what she looks like? And the answer is, well, that's not a part of his role. He's only looking at the feet. He's actually acting a little bit like a bouncer for the aristocracy and the nobility. Only the right people can get in to the club. And since he's only caring about her status, her class status, he's not looking at her in the face. He's only really looking at her feet. Now, the Grimms do add violence to the story. They change the description of what the stepsisters do to their own toes. They make that a little bit more bloody. And then they do add this bit at the end that you're possibly familiar with, where the birds come along and peck out her eyes. And so these were changes done to by the second version of the tale, so that the evil is punished and the good is rewarded, and that's kind of the Christian message associated with the Grimm's version. All right, well, let's talk about Sigmund Freud. First, we'll talk about Freud in general. Freud was a psychologist, of course, from Austria, famous today for his mind topography, meaning that we have a conscious mind and an unconscious mind, and he used terms like the ego, the superego, and the id. In German, it's translated better as the I, and then the over I, and then the it is what he calls the id. The id being the one associated more with instincts. It's a subconscious drive for things like survival, or he gets rather esoteric, talks about the death drive at some point. But his emphasis on the subconscious mind is the real lasting effect. And when people think about a Freudian slip, where you can't think of it consciously, but subconsciously it slips out. And this is why we have dream analysis, where you look at what your dreams were, your subconscious mind is taking over. That must mean something to that part of your brain. And what free association is all about is kind of following words backwards to the stuff that you can't get at in your subconscious. Your conscious mind can't get there. It's only subconscious. And this is the work of psychoanalysis, which is misspelled actually on the screen. So the Oedipal complex is another one of the famous things from Freud. This is his postulation about childhood sexuality. All children have a sexual drive, even early, and the male child in particular starts recognizing, well, the person nearest him, the person that he loves, the person who provides food, is his mother, and so he forms a kind of bond towards his mother, a quasi-sexual bond, and in that sense, the father represents competition. So Oedipus Rex, the Greek tragedy, was one in which the hero was destined to marry his mother and kill his father as competition, and that's why Freud uses Oedipus, or the Oedipal complex, to name the thing he's talking about here, where there's kind of a bit of built-in lust or love for one's mother, and puts the father into a different relationship, one of competition, and this is where castration anxiety comes from. Actually, that one is afraid that the father might castrate you. This is all stuff that Freud brought out not only in his publications, but he had done himself an interpretation of a fairy tale called The Sandman, written by E.T.A. Hoffmann. And he talks about these very issues. And so doing a Freudian analysis of fairy tales begins with Freud himself. Now, Bruno Bettelheim is a more modern-day psychologist. He's passed away now, but his very seminal book, The Uses of Enchantment, is one that is always quoted whenever there's fairy tale stories in the news. So if a public school bans Red Riding Hood, for instance, they often quote The Uses of Enchantment. So it's a very well-known book. And yet its central thesis is a really strange one. Bettelheim purports to be able to interpret and therefore understand what it is that young children, 3-year-old children, think subconsciously when they hear a story like Red Riding Hood. So not only is he claiming to know what a child thinks when they hear that story, he thinks he can know what the child interprets subconsciously. And so he'll take the symbols of the story and weave a Freudian analysis around them. And he does things like the slipper having to do with a foot fetish, fetishization. That's the sexual drive being one of the main things driving us. The princess fixated on the foot because there's a sexual fetishization with it. The blood that comes about because the sisters are cutting off pieces of their toes, pieces of their feet, he associates with first bleeding, with menstruation, which makes the foot of the slipper a vagina. And so that's what the blood is slipping out of that, and that's what the foot fetish is all about. The foot fetish is filling in the vagina. So that's a complete system in Bettelheim's view. Now, what he does get that I think is a little easier to swallow is the bit about sibling rivalry and sexual rivalry and competing for the affection of your parents. And so that, I think, that part of the Oedipal complex is a little bit easier to go along with because it's right there in the story. It's in the plot line of the story itself. So that brings us to the end of this mini narrative. Most of the lectures will not be quite so long as this one, since we had to get some of the background information about the authors out of the way. You can look forward to them being a little bit shorter going forward.